Okay, hi everyone, and welcome to week 10, third last week, second last week of new content. So today we're going to discuss juries and decision makings. What is the point of having a jury and what do they actually do? And how do forensic psychologists fall into all of this and what is their role in regards to juries? All right, so what are we going to be doing today? It's going to take forever to go to the next slide. There we go. Our learning objectives. So by the end of this week, you should understand what a jury is and how and when they are used. I think some of you probably already know that from Greg's class, but we'll talk about that a bit more. What are the factors that affect jury deliberations? And we're going to look at two different types of jury deliberation styles. We're going to also discuss the role of group processes in jury decision making, because remember, we're talking here about putting 12 people who've never met each other and they don't know each other or anything about each other. We're putting them into a jury box and asking them to try and come up with a unanimous decision on the fate of someone who's committed a crime. So there are a lot of group processes that go on, and that's a really big thing that you would talk about in psychology, is group processes in all sorts of parts of life rather than just jury decision making. We're going to discuss what's meant by a scientific jury selection, and we're going to analyse the limitations of jury simulation research, and there are many. And then we're going to consider the new types of evidence juries may these days be required or expected to consider. So we need to start somewhere. What are juries all about? Well, as those of you who've done police courts and criminal law should know, juries are only used once you get past the magistrate's court. So really, when you look at the numbers of cases, and we looked at them in the past, that go through our courts, the vast majority of criminal cases do not have a jury. So it's only a very small number. I know that if you watch a lot of TV, it might lead you to think that every criminal case has a jury, but not every criminal case does. So they're only available in the higher courts, such as the district and Supreme Courts, and in rare circumstances for civil trials, but not very often at all in civil trials. So just thinking back to the previous lecture where we did discuss how many people go through the different courts each year, so nearly 180,000 through the Mags Court, 5.5 through district, and around 1,500 through Supreme. So juries are only needed in the higher courts, so the number is quite small. In 2010 and 11 in Queensland, only 4% of defendants were finalised in the district or Supreme Court. So the vast majority of people who appear in court plead guilty and get their sentence, and they're on their way. So the jury is not required, because the role of the jury is to establish guilt. So if the person pleads guilty, they're just actually not needed. So how are jurors selected? Well, they have a panel of prospective jurors from which the jury is selected. This is called the jury pool, or a veneer. So any of you who have received that letter in the mail, which I have done a couple of times in the last 12 months, you are part of the veneer, the panel of prospective jurors to select the jury from. So anyone who is able to vote in an election can be selected to go on a jury. There are still people who can't vote in elections. Migrants who are not citizens cannot vote. You have to be a permanent resident. So we have the Jury Act, which governs how selection and procedures are done. There are some people who can be automatically excluded as jurors based on occupation. So police officers, corrections officers are able to just be automatically excluded. If you have a criminal history, or if you're aged over 70. Now, just because you're aged over 70 doesn't mean that you can't be on a jury. It just means that you can be automatically excluded if you wish. If you need to get out of it, you can use employment or medical condition to get out of it. I usually just tell them that I teach criminology and that I never hear back from them ever again. So some of the reasons that people can use to get out of it is if you're a fly-in, fly-out worker, for example, and you couldn't be here. Because you don't get paid enough money on a jury to replace what you would earn, employment becomes a really, really big issue for people who get called up to jury service. What if you were called up to be on a jury and it was right through the middle of exam period? Well, you could use that as a reason why you couldn't sit on the jury. But the thing is that juries are supposed to be representative of one's peers in the community. And realistically, this is never going to happen because we're all so different. To find peers that are exactly like us is going to be just not realistic at all. So we end up with juries who are usually represented by younger people, so maybe university students who can work their studies around doing jury duty or do it during a break. And if they earn a little bit of extra money, they can be grateful for that. Older people who are retired, therefore aren't bound by going to work every day. And unemployed people who've got the time to go and sit and be on a jury and again earn a little bit of extra money. So these are the three groups that tend to be overrepresented on juries. So how are juries selected? Well, the first stage is where eligible jurors are assessed and impanelled. So for this to happen, you can be paraded in front of the prosecution and the defence, and without even speaking to you, knowing anything about you or asking you any questions, they can judge you and decide whether you can go on the jury or not. So as you'll see in one of the film clips that I've got for you exactly how this works, you have all the potential jurists or the veneer standing to one side in the courtroom. Their name is called and they simply walk across in front of the tables where the defence and the prosecution are sitting, and either one of them can say challenge, and they get told thank you very much and you are finished. In a criminal trial, they're entitled to do that 8 times each. So they don't have to give a reason. They can just 8 times say challenge and the person is dismissed. In a criminal or civil trial, they may challenge for cause against the person. So they might say that they're not qualified for jury service or that they're not impartial. So if the defence found out, for example, that the person who is a potential juror had a job or a friendship group that could lead them back to the defendant, that may lead to them not being partial. And if that comes out in the course of the case, then it can lead to a mistrial. So the judge needs to uphold or dismiss the challenge for cause based on the evidence and the submission of the party. Just as an aside, and this is not examinable or anything, but Falero and Penrod conducted research . Apologies for the phone ringing in the background. Okay, so a little bit of a fun thing that is not examinable, as I said. Falero and Penrod conducted research looking at what was written in texts about female jurors and found the following. Avoid women as they are unpredictable and influenced by their husbands. Old women wearing too much makeup are unstable and bad for state prosecutors. Women are not good for the defence of attractive females. Women are sympathetic and extraordinarily conscientious jurors. Women's livers may be antagonistic to male defendants. I can only find one there that's true, and that's the one about sympathetic and extraordinarily conscientious. Anyway, that's just for you to have a little bit of a giggle about. Okay, so the jury foreperson. What is the role of the jury foreperson? Well, their role is to guide the deliberation process and be the representative of the jury to the judge. So if the jury needs clarification about something, it is the foreperson who will ask, not the particular juror who may be seeking the clarification. And overall, as you can see from these characteristics, women are less likely to be the foreperson. Sometimes that can be because the women don't want to be, but if it goes to a vote, they're less likely to be selected. So the characteristics are that they're usually male, middle-aged, and professional, whether they're professional now or have been professional in the past, higher education and SES, and the place at the table influences choice. So what is meant by this is if the table is a rectangle and the foreperson sits at the head of the table, they are more likely to be chosen. Not influenced, they're the first person to speak or mention choosing, and they're not influenced by attentiveness during the trial. So they could be falling asleep during the trial and they're still going to get selected. The foreperson tends to speak more and control polling, especially in decisions of guilt. And as that quote there says, individual attitudes, beliefs and prejudices as they are brought out in discussions of a particular point at issue have greater influence on verdict than personal or social characteristics. All right, juror selection. So we have spoken, or I have mentioned at length in the past, about the Fitzgerald inquiry into corruption in Queensland police and government in the late 1980s. After that was all completed and presented, or before it was presented, Joh Bjelke-Petersen, who was the state premier and is still Queensland's longest serving premier, was charged with, I think it was perjury, and yes, he was charged with perjury. So this dramatisation was based on the transcripts and the interviews from those in the jury room. Now, as you'll see later when we discuss research into jury simulation, having access to people who actually sat on this jury is extremely rare, because that's just simply not allowed under our law. So it was extremely rare. Joh was accused of lying to the Fitzgerald inquiry and was accused of perjury, and this was the trial. So I want you to watch those two links there. One of them, you just started at 1:40 and watch it as long as you want, and then watch how they select a foreman and then come back. Okay, so were any of you perceptive enough to notice the changes in the music when Luke Shaw stepped up? And think back, how did he look to you when he first stepped up in court? So this is what he looked like when he came back to start the trial, with his hair all cut short and in his suit, whereas when he was selected to be on the jury, he had long hair and he was just wearing a t-shirt and looking quite scruffy. He was chosen to be on the jury for the perjury trial. Now this trial, as you've got to remember, in the late 80s, early 90s, it was very, very public and it had huge media attention in Queensland. So the suggestion is that there's something about Luke Shaw that is a little bit suspicious. And there was, that he became the subject of some pretty heavy media scrutiny throughout the trial and after the trial, when it came to light that he was actually a member of the National Party, of the Young Nationals, and a huge fan of Sir Joh. So yeah, I can remember it well. All right, let's move away and talk about scientific jury selection. So voix droit is the process in the USA. Aren't you impressed with my French, which is really lousy? But it is French, and it means to speak the truth. So the first major account, let's go back, research conducted to develop techniques to select juries. So what this scientific jury selection is all about is getting jury selection experts hired by either side who come in and look at the characteristics of the jurors that the side that hires them will want in their jury. Okay, so this is where we're trying to pick people to be on the jury who are going to be advantageous to our side of the argument. The first account of this was in the defence of the Harrisburg 7. So this was where the expert told the defence who they should have on the jury. So the Harrisburg 7, they were charged with conspiracy during America's involvement in the Vietnam War. And this group consisted of priests, nuns and ex-nuns, and they were all anti-war activists. They were accused of various very Christian plots, such as including planning to bomb the heating tunnels in Washington and to kidnap Henry Kissinger, who was the assistant to the President for National Affairs. Very Christian actions. Heating tunnels in Washington, it just means that between like the White House and other buildings, instead of people having to go outside in winter when it can be very, very cold, they have heated tunnels underneath. I have heard that in Canada, it's actually, there are heating tunnels at universities. So you would go to uni for the day and probably never go outside because everything would be underground because it's so cold. So what happened was that this trial was being held in a very conservative pro-war area that was seen to be very, very favourable to the prosecution. So the defence was trying to use scientific jury selection to select a jury that would be more sympathetic to these defendants. Okay? The thing is with this, though, that you have to remember that it's usually only the prosecution that would have the resources to employ scientific jury selection, because these experts charge a bucket load of money for their expertise. And, you know, defence people often don't have a lot of money to spend on their own defence, let alone paying for these experts. And at the end of the day, it made no difference. So some research that was done by Ziesel and Diamond found that there was actually no difference between the verdicts of actual and biased or rejected juries. And how they found these juries was that they carried a survey out on people who were similar to those who may have been chosen for the jury in the Harrisburg 7 trial, to find people who had the right beliefs as they saw it. And if you have a look in the textbook, it's got a list of what they were asked. And over there, don't forget that it was, it's left to the judge to actually make the decision of who will be allowed on the jury anyway, so the judge could have actually stopped these people being on this jury. They did find, though, in 1980 some evidence that it's more accurate for drug and court-martial cases. So the prediction of the verdict was based on stereotypes of gender, race, class or personality, and it's unreliable. But what they were saying is, oh, well, you're female, so I think you will acquit. So this is really unreliable. The techniques to select jurors have been criticised, and research findings are limited, since those who can afford trial or jury consultants can also afford private defence teams. These experts are really expensive. So the very rich are more likely to be able to afford one of these experts, and it's simply not available to everyone. And then overwhelmingly, they found anyway that jurors seem to render verdicts based on the evidence presented in the case rather than their own biases, personality and attitudes. Okay, that's the end of part 1. We'll come back and talk in part 2 about jury decision making. So what factors affect juries' deliberations and decision making?